When I found those legal documents hidden in my late son's desk, I realized my own children had been lying to me for 20 years, and the family fortune I thought belonged to them was never theirs to begin with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral reception was winding down when my daughter-in-law Claire finally said what had been hanging in the air for weeks. The Riverside Country Club was nearly empty, just a few stragglers picking at the remaining sandwiches and whispering about my son Michael's sudden heart attack at 52. I was collecting the sympathy cards from the memorial table when Claire approached, her black Chanel dress impeccable even after 8 hours of grief performance. Behind her stood my other children, David, my younger son, and my daughter Rachel, all wearing the same uncomfortable expression. "Eleanor," Claire said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news wrapped in fake concern. "We need to discuss the arrangements." My stomach tightened. Michael had been gone only a week. The will reading wasn't scheduled for another few days. What arrangements? David cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it would be best if you moved to Sunset Manor. It's a beautiful place, really. Top-rated care, activities, people your own age." The words hit me like ice water. "A nursing home?" "An assisted living community," Rachel corrected gently, though her tone was rehearsed. "Mom, you're 73. Living alone in that big house isn't safe anymore. And honestly, with Michael gone..." She trailed off, but the implication hung heavy. I looked around at my children, the babies I'd raised, the adults I'd helped through college, career changes, divorces, and crises. I'm not senile. I'm not helpless. I've been managing perfectly fine. Claire stepped closer, her hand touching my arm with practiced sympathy. "Of course you have. But the Whitmore estate is so isolated. What if something happens? And frankly, Eleanor, the upkeep costs are enormous. Michael was barely managing the expenses." "The estate has been in our family for 4 generations, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Your grandfather built that house with his own hands, and it's beautiful," David said quickly. "But Mom, it's also a money pit. The roof needs work, the heating system is ancient, and the property taxes alone." He shook his head. "We can't afford to maintain it, and we can't ask you to." Something cold settled in my chest. "We?" Rachel and David exchanged a glance. "Well, as Michael's heirs, and given that Dad's been gone for 15 years, the estate will eventually..." Rachel fumbled for words. "You're planning my funeral already?" I asked quietly. "Mom, no," David protested. "We just want what's best for you. Sunset Manor has a waiting list, but they have an opening next month. The timing is perfect." Perfect. As if my entire life could be dismantled and relocated like furniture to make room for their inheritance plans. "I need time to think," I said. Claire's smile was sympathetic but firm. "Of course. But Eleanor, the deposit is due by Friday. And honestly, at your age, these decisions are better made by family who can think clearly." The words stung worse than a slap. At my age. As if turning 73 had somehow rendered me incompetent overnight. I gathered my purse and coat without another word. "I'll be in touch," I said, walking past them toward the exit. "Mom, wait," Rachel called after me. "Let us drive you home." "I'm perfectly capable of driving myself," I replied without turning around. Despite my advanced age, the drive back to Whitmore Estate took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads. 40 minutes to replay every word, every glance, every carefully planned phrase. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway of the sprawling Tudor mansion that had been my home for over 50 years, one thing was crystal clear. My own children were trying to dispose of me like an inconvenient piece of furniture, and they were lying about something. I could feel it in my bones, the same instinct that had warned me about Claire before David married her, the same feeling that had told me something was wrong with Michael's business dealings in his final months. As I sat in my car, looking up at the house where I'd raised my family, hosted countless dinners, and weathered decades of joy and sorrow, I made a decision. I wasn't going anywhere. Not until I figured out what they were really hiding. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's face from our last conversation, the way he'd looked when he'd said he had something important to discuss with me. When things settled down, he'd been trying to tell me about Claire's scheme, and now he was gone. The house felt different in the darkness, full of shadows and secrets I'd never noticed before. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, made me wonder if I was truly alone. If Claire was capable of orchestrating such an elaborate financial conspiracy, what else might she be capable of? I spent the early morning hours going through every document in Michael's office more carefully, taking detailed notes and making copies of everything that seemed important. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The mysterious loan against the estate was just the beginning. Claire had somehow gained access to Michael's business accounts and had been slowly siphoning money into accounts I didn't recognize. She'd been forging his signature on contracts and agreements that would have bankrupted the family business within 6 months. The paper trail was meticulous and damning. Transfer orders that moved money from legitimate business accounts into shell companies with names like Mountain View Holdings and Cascade Investment Partners. Purchase orders for equipment and materials that were never delivered, with payments going to vendors that didn't seem to exist when I tried to look them up online. It was systematic embezzlement, disguised as normal business operations. But the most chilling discovery came when I found Michael's medical records hidden in a password-protected folder on his computer. The password, heartbreakingly, had been my maiden name, something only family would know. Inside, I found emails between Michael and his cardiologist, Dr. Patterson, discussing concerns about irregular heart rhythms that had started about 6 months ago, right around the time Claire had begun pressuring him to sign the transfer documents. Dr. Patterson had recommended stress tests and had prescribed medication to regulate Michael's heart rhythm. The emails showed Michael's concern about his symptoms, his willingness to follow medical advice, his determination to get healthy for the sake of his family. But according to the pharmacy records I found, Michael had never picked up the prescription. In fact, there was a note in his medical file indicating that someone calling themselves Mrs. Whitmore had contacted the pharmacy to say the medication was no longer needed because Michael had decided to try natural remedies instead. I knew my son. Michael wouldn't have ignored his doctor's advice about heart medication. He was cautious about his health, especially after watching his father battle cancer for 6 grueling months. He'd been the one to insist that Robert get second opinions, to research treatment options, to make sure every medical recommendation was followed to the letter. Someone had interfered with his medical care, and I was beginning to have a terrifying suspicion about who that someone might be. There was more. Medical insurance claims that had been denied because someone had changed Michael's coverage without his knowledge. Appointments with specialists that had been mysteriously canceled. A pattern of interference that went back months, all designed to ensure that Michael's heart condition would worsen without proper treatment. By 6 a.m, I was exhausted but too wired to rest. My hands were shaking as I made coffee, the reality of what I'd discovered settling into my bones like winter cold. Someone had systematically undermined my son's health care, while simultaneously destroying his business and stealing his assets. The timing of his death wasn't a tragic coincidence. It was the inevitable result of a carefully orchestrated campaign of sabotage. I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by printouts and documents, trying to figure out my next move. I needed help, but who could I trust? David and Rachel had clearly been manipulated into supporting Claire's plan to move me to Sunset Manor. My lawyer, Harold Morrison, had been Robert's friend for 40 years, but he was 83 now and might not be sharp enough to handle something this complex. The police would probably dismiss the concerns of a grieving 73-year-old widow as paranoid delusions. The isolation was crushing. For the first time in my adult life, I had no one to turn to, no one who would believe me. No one who could help me fight back against this nightmare. That's when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was barely 7 a.m, and I'd just buried my son yesterday. I looked out the front window and saw Claire's black Mercedes parked in my driveway, sleek and predatory in the morning light. My blood ran cold as I watched her stride up the front walk, dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, carrying what looked like a briefcase and a cardboard box. She had a key. Of course she had a key. Michael would have given her one years ago for emergencies. But the fact that she was using it now, letting herself into my house without permission, told me everything I needed to know about how she really viewed our relationship. I was no longer family to be respected. I was an obstacle to be managed. "Eleanor?" She called from the front hall, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged rooms. "I hope you don't mind." I let myself in. "I brought some things from Michael's office that need to be sorted through." I quickly gathered up all my documents and papers, shoving them into a manila envelope that I slipped into the kitchen junk drawer behind old takeout menus and broken flashlights. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee, trying to look like a grieving mother who'd been up early because she couldn't sleep, not like a woman who'd just spent the night uncovering evidence of a conspiracy that included murder. "I'm in the kitchen," I called back, proud that my voice sounded steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. Claire appeared in the doorway a moment later, her expression a perfect mask of sympathetic concern. She'd always been beautiful in a cold, calculated way. Perfect blonde hair, flawless makeup, clothes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. But now that I knew what she really was, I could see the predator lurking beneath the polished surface. "Oh, Eleanor, you look exhausted," she said, setting down her briefcase and cardboard box on the kitchen counter with the casual proprietary air of someone who already considered this her house. "Did you get any sleep at all?" "Not much," I admitted, which was the truth. "It's hard to rest when—" I let my voice trail off, as if I were too emotional to continue. She moved to the coffee maker with the familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time in this kitchen, helping herself to a mug from the cabinet and adding cream from the refrigerator. "Of course it is. Losing a child is the worst thing any parent can go through. I can't even imagine the pain you're feeling right now." The false sympathy in her voice made my skin crawl. She was standing in my kitchen, drinking my coffee, expressing concern for my grief while actively working to destroy everything I had left. The audacity was breathtaking. "But you know, Eleanor," she continued, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee, "this just reinforces what we talked about yesterday. You shouldn't be alone in this big house, especially when you're grieving. It's not healthy for someone your age to be isolated like this." I watched her move around my kitchen like she owned it, acting like the concerned daughter-in-law while calculating her next move. But now that I knew what she was really up to, I could see the manipulation behind every gesture, every carefully chosen word. She was studying me, looking for signs of weakness, figuring out how much pressure she needed to apply to break me completely. "What brings you by so early?" I asked, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug to keep them from shaking. "I need to collect some business documents from Michael's office," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp and assessing. "There are some urgent contracts that need to be addressed, and I want to make sure nothing falls through the cracks while we're sorting out the succession planning." Succession planning. The phrase made my skin crawl, especially now that I knew what it really meant. In Claire's vocabulary, succession planning apparently meant systematic theft and murder. "What kind of contracts?" "Oh, nothing you need to worry about," she said with a patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just routine business stuff. Michael had so many different projects going, and some of the clients are getting anxious about whether their jobs will be completed on schedule." That was another lie. I'd seen Michael's project files during my late-night investigation, and the business was actually ahead of schedule on most contracts. Claire was probably planning to cancel the contracts, pocket the deposits, and blame the chaos on Michael's sudden death. "I'd like to be involved in those decisions," I said carefully. "After all, I'm still a part owner of Whitmore Construction." Claire's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it. But I saw it. A flash of irritation, quickly suppressed. "Well, actually, Eleanor, that's something we need to discuss. Michael made some changes to the business structure in the last few months that affect ownership percentages. I have all the paperwork upstairs if you'd like to review it." What kind of changes? Nothing dramatic, she said quickly, but I could hear the lie in her voice. Just some reorganization to make the succession planning smoother. You know how complex these things can get with tax implications and liability issues. Michael was always so worried about protecting the family assets. I nodded as if I understood, but inside I was screaming. She was sitting across from me, drinking coffee in my kitchen, calmly explaining how she'd forged documents to steal my family's business, while my son's body was barely cold in the ground. I'll go get those documents, she said, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. And I'll collect the business files I need while I'm up there. It shouldn't take long. After she left the kitchen, I sat frozen at the table, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She was upstairs right now, probably going through Michael's computer and files. Would she notice that someone had been accessing his email? Had I covered my tracks well enough? Or was she about to discover that I knew everything? I forced myself to stay calm, to sip my coffee and act like a confused old woman who didn't understand business matters. But inside, I was planning my next move, trying to figure out how to survive what was clearly going to be an all-out assault on my freedom and sanity. The minutes dragged by like hours. I could hear her moving around upstairs, opening drawers, shuffling papers. At one point, I heard what sounded like a filing cabinet being opened and closed. She was being thorough, making sure she had everything she needed to complete her takeover. 20 minutes later, she came back downstairs carrying a thick folder and looking satisfied with whatever she'd accomplished. I found everything I needed, she announced, settling back into her chair with the air of someone who'd just completed an important task. And Eleanor, I have to say, I'm even more concerned about you after seeing the state of Michael's office. There are papers scattered everywhere, some of them quite important. It's clear that this house is becoming too much for you to manage properly. The audacity of it took my breath away. She was criticizing my housekeeping skills while actively robbing me blind, using my son's death as an opportunity to accelerate her criminal enterprise. Michael was always a bit disorganized with his paperwork, I said mildly, trying to hide my rage behind a mask of elderly confusion. Well, that's exactly my point, she replied, leaning forward with false earnestness. You shouldn't have to deal with cleaning up these kinds of messes at your age. That's why I've taken the liberty of scheduling a tour of Sunset Manor for you this afternoon. This afternoon? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, betraying my shock at how quickly she was moving. I know it seems soon, but Eleanor, the opening they have won't last long. These facilities have waiting lists that stretch for months, sometimes years. If we don't move quickly, you could end up somewhere much less desirable. I've already spoken to the admissions coordinator, and she's agreed to waive some of the usual waiting periods, given the tragic circumstances. My son's death was being used as leverage to pressure me into giving up my home, my independence, my entire life. The speed of it was breathtaking. Michael had been dead for less than 48 hours, and Claire was already implementing the final phase of her plan. I haven't agreed to anything yet, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire's smile became strained, and for a moment, I saw something cold and dangerous flash in her eyes. Of course not, Eleanor. But let's be practical here. Look around you. This house is falling apart. The heating bills alone are going to bankrupt you this winter. The roof needs major repairs. The electrical system is a fire hazard, and without Michael here to handle all the maintenance issues. She shook her head sadly, as if she were genuinely concerned about my welfare rather than orchestrating my downfall. I've been managing this house for 50 years, I said. But you've never been 73 and alone before, she countered, her voice taking on a sharper edge. And frankly, some of the decisions you've been making lately have me worried about your judgment. That was a new attack, and a particularly cruel one. She was questioning my mental competence, laying the groundwork for whatever came next. What decisions? Well, for instance, I found unpaid bills in Michael's office. Important bills, like insurance premiums and property taxes. If those don't get paid soon, you could lose the house anyway. Another lie. I paid all the household bills myself, and everything was current. I kept meticulous records, just as Robert had taught me. But I could see what she was doing. Creating a false narrative of declining competence, building a case that I was unable to handle my own affairs. I don't recall any unpaid bills. That's exactly what I'm worried about, she said with false gentleness, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people use with small children or mental patients. Memory issues are nothing to be ashamed of at your age, Eleanor, but they are something we need to address before they become dangerous. The conversation was making me feel sick. Every word out of her mouth was designed to undermine my confidence, to make me doubt my own perceptions and capabilities. It was psychological warfare disguised as family concern, and it was working. Despite everything I'd discovered, despite the evidence of her crimes, I was starting to question myself. Was I remembering things correctly? Had I been making mistakes I wasn't aware of? Maybe the bills really were unpaid. Maybe I was losing my mind and didn't realize it. Maybe Claire and my children were right, and I was just too stubborn and proud to admit that I needed help. I think I need some time to process all of this, I said, standing up from the table on unsteady legs. Of course, Claire agreed readily, but there was satisfaction in her voice. She could sense my uncertainty, could see that her psychological manipulation was having the desired effect. But Eleanor, the tour's at 2:00 this afternoon. David and Rachel are planning to meet us there. It would mean a lot to them if you'd at least look at the facility before making any final decisions. The trap was closing around me. My own children had been recruited to participate in this charade, probably convinced that they were acting in my best interests. How could I fight all three of them when they presented a united front? How could I prove that their concern was based on lies when the lies were so carefully constructed? I'll think about it, I said, which was the most non-committal response I could manage. Wonderful, Claire said, gathering up her briefcase and folder with the air of someone who'd just completed a successful business negotiation. I'll pick you up at 1:30. And Eleanor? You might want to think about what you'd like to take with you to Sunset Manor. They have very nice furnished apartments, so you won't need much. Just personal items, some clothes, a few favorite books, perhaps. She was already talking about my move as if it were a done deal, as if my opinion were just a formality to be observed before the inevitable outcome. The presumption was staggering, but I could see the cold logic behind it. She'd been planning this for months, manipulating my children, forging documents, systematically destroying Michael's health and business. Why wouldn't she be confident about the final step? After she left, I stood at the kitchen window watching her drive away, my hands shaking with rage and fear and something else I was ashamed to identify: defeat. She was moving so fast, applying so much pressure from so many different angles, that I barely had time to think, let alone plan a defense. The tour this afternoon was clearly meant to be the final step in convincing me to sign away my independence. But there was something else bothering me, something beyond the obvious manipulation and the breakneck pace of events. Claire had been too confident, too certain that her plan would work. She was acting like someone who knew there were no other options, no way for me to fight back effectively. That suggested she had more leverage than just family pressure and psychological manipulation. I went back to Michael's office and continued searching through his files, looking for anything that might explain Claire's confidence. What I found made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Hidden in a folder labeled Personal Insurance Documents was a copy of a medical power of attorney document that I'd never seen before. According to the paperwork, if I were ever declared mentally incompetent by a licensed physician, Claire would automatically gain control over all my medical and financial decisions. The document was dated 6 months ago and bore what looked like my signature at the bottom. Except I'd never signed any such document. I'd never even seen it before this moment. I examined the signature closely, my hands trembling as I held the paper up to the light. It was a good forgery, but not perfect. The way I dotted my I's was slightly different, and the slant of my handwriting was just a bit off. The loops in my E's were too round, and the pressure of the pen strokes was inconsistent with my natural writing style. But it would probably fool most people who weren't looking for fraud, especially if they weren't familiar with my handwriting. The implications were staggering. With this document, Claire could have me declared incompetent by a cooperative doctor, then institutionalize me against my will while taking control of all my assets. The tour of Sunset Manor this afternoon wasn't just about convincing me to move voluntarily. It was about establishing a paper trail for an involuntary commitment if I refused to cooperate. I kept reading, and the horror deepened. There were backup plans within backup plans. If the medical power of attorney didn't work, there was a guardianship petition already prepared, complete with statements from David and Rachel about their concerns for my welfare. If that failed, there were debt documents showing that I owed money to various creditors, money that would need to be paid through the sale of the estate. Every contingency had been covered. Every possible avenue of resistance had been anticipated and blocked. Claire hadn't just been planning to steal my assets. She'd been planning to completely destroy my life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Eleanor Whitmore but a confused old woman in a nursing home, with no money, no family, and no hope. I was trapped. If I went to the police with accusations of forgery and conspiracy, who would believe me? A 73-year-old woman claiming that her devoted daughter-in-law was trying to steal her fortune? They'd probably assume I was having delusions brought on by grief and age, especially if Claire produced the forged power of attorney and got a psychiatrist to declare me incompetent. If I refused to go to the tour this afternoon, Claire would probably use that as evidence of my declining mental state. She'd tell David and Rachel that I was becoming paranoid and irrational, that I was refusing help and putting myself in danger. With the forged documents as backup, she could probably have me committed within days. If I did go to the tour, I'd be walking into what amounted to an ambush, with David and Rachel already convinced that institutionalizing me was the right thing to do. They'd see my resistance as proof of the mental decline Claire had been warning them about. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly helpless. I sat in Michael's desk chair, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy I couldn't prove to anyone who mattered, facing an enemy who had spent months planning my downfall while I'd been obliviously going about my daily life. Claire had thought of everything. She'd manipulated my children, destroyed my son's health, forged my signature, and created a web of lies so complex and convincing that even I was starting to doubt my own sanity. She'd been playing chess while I'd been playing checkers, and now I was in checkmate with no moves left. At 73, I was about to lose everything I'd spent a lifetime building. My home, my independence, my dignity, even my freedom. All of it was slipping away, and there didn't seem to be anything I could do to stop it. The phone rang, startling me out of my despair. The caller ID showed David's number. "Hi, Mom," he said when I answered, his voice carefully cheerful in the way people talk to invalids or mental patients. "I just wanted to check on you before this afternoon. Claire told me about the tour at Sunset Manor. I think you're going to be really impressed with the facility." "David," I began, then stopped. What could I say? That his beloved sister-in-law was a criminal who had possibly murdered his brother? That he'd been manipulated into betraying his own mother? That everything he thought he knew about the situation was based on lies and forged documents? He'd never believe me, not without proof I couldn't provide. "I know this is hard," he continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that seemed to be everyone's default when talking to me now. "But Mom, we're all worried about you. Living alone in that big house, especially right after losing Michael, it's not safe. Rachel and I have been talking, and we really think this is the best option for everyone." Everyone except me, I thought bitterly. But I was apparently no longer a person whose opinion mattered. I was just a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be managed. "I just need more time to think about it." "I understand," David said, but there was impatience in his voice. "But Mom, you can't put this off indefinitely. The longer you wait, the harder it's going to be to make the transition. And honestly, some of the things Claire has told me about the state of the house and your bills, I'm worried that waiting might not be an option much longer." More lies from Claire, designed to create urgency and panic. "What things?" "Just practical stuff. Money issues that Michael is apparently handling for you, bills that aren't getting paid, maintenance problems that are getting worse. Without him there to take care of those details." David sighed, and I could hear the genuine concern in his voice. He really believed he was helping me, which made his betrayal even more painful. "Look, we'll talk about everything this afternoon," he continued. "But Mom, please keep an open mind. We're not trying to get rid of you. We're trying to take care of you the way you took care of us when we were children." After I hung up, I realized that I was crying. Not the dignified tears of grief I'd shed for Michael, but the bitter tears of betrayal and fear. My own children had turned against me, convinced by a master manipulator that they were acting out of love when they were actually participating in my destruction. I was 73 years old, recently widowed, with no allies and no clear way to fight back against a conspiracy that had been months in the making. Claire had thought of everything, covered every angle, anticipated every possible resistance. She'd turned my own family against me, using their love and concern as weapons. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly defeated. The woman who had raised 3 children, managed a household and helped run a business, survived the death of her husband and countless other challenges, was about to be destroyed by someone who was supposed to be family. I sat alone in my big house, surrounded by 5 decades of memories that were about to be sold off and scattered to strangers, and wondered if this was how my story was going to end. Not with dignity and respect for a life well lived, but with being shuffled off to an institution by people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. The worst part was that I was starting to doubt myself. The psychological manipulation was working, even though I knew it was manipulation. Maybe I was too old to live alone in this big house. Maybe I was making mistakes I wasn't aware of. Maybe my memory really was failing, and I was imagining threats that didn't exist. Maybe Claire and my children were right, and I was just too stubborn and proud to admit that I needed help. At 1 o'clock, I got dressed for the tour of Sunset Manor, choosing a simple blue dress and my good pearls, the ones Robert had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. If this was going to be my last day of freedom, I was determined to face it with whatever dignity I had left. But as I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, looking at the reflection of a tired old woman who seemed to have aged years in just 2 days, I made myself a promise. Even if I couldn't win this battle, I wasn't going to surrender without a fight. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to expose Claire's lies and protect what was left of my family's legacy. I just had to find it before it was too late. Because if I didn't, Eleanor Whitmore was going to disappear as surely as if I'd never existed at all. At 1:25, I was standing by my front window, watching for Claire's Mercedes, and steeling myself for what I was certain would be the beginning of the end of my independence. My small purse contained only the essentials: my driver's license, a credit card, and a folded copy of one of the most damning emails I'd found between Claire and Harrison Price. If this was going to be my last act of defiance, at least I'd have some evidence with me, even if no one would believe it. But Claire's car never came. Instead, at exactly 1:30, a battered pickup truck turned into my driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle. It was old, maybe 15 years, with rust around the wheel wells and a toolbox in the back. The driver was a woman about my age, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing what looked like work clothes. She climbed out of the truck with the easy movement of someone accustomed to physical labor, glanced up at the house with an appraising eye, then walked purposefully to my front door. When the doorbell rang, I hesitated. This had to be some kind of mistake. I opened the door to find a woman with sharp blue eyes, weathered hands, and a no-nonsense expression that reminded me of my own mother. She was probably in her early 70s, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone much younger. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "My name is Margaret Chen. I think we need to talk." Something in her voice, the urgency, the certainty, made me step back and gesture her inside. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met. Are you sure you have the right house?" "Oh, I have the right house," she said, following me into the front hall and looking around with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to assess property. "And I have the right person. You're Eleanor Whitmore, widow of Robert Whitmore, mother of Michael Whitmore, who died 3 days ago, and currently being systematically destroyed by a woman named Claire who isn't who she claims to be." I stopped walking and turned to stare at her. "What did you say?" "I said Claire isn't who she claims to be," Margaret repeated calmly. "Her real name is Claire Price, and she's been running this particular scam for about 8 years now. She targets wealthy widows and widowers, marries into the family, then slowly destroys them financially and emotionally until she can take everything. You're not her first victim, Mrs. Whitmore. You're her fourth. Quote, ... The world seemed to tilt sideways, I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. That's impossible. She's been married to my son for 6 years. Has she? Margaret asked, raising an eyebrow. Or has someone calling herself Claire Whitmore been married to your son for 6 years? When was the last time you saw their marriage certificate? When was the last time you verified her background, her education, her family? I opened my mouth to answer, then realized I couldn't. I'd never seen their marriage certificate. Michael had said they'd had a small ceremony in Las Vegas, just the two of them, very romantic and spontaneous. I had never met any of Claire's family. She'd said they were estranged, that it was too painful to talk about. Her college friends never visited. Her work colleagues never came to family gatherings. Who are you? I whispered. Margaret's expression softened slightly. I'm someone who's been where you are. Claire, or whatever she was calling herself then, married my brother-in-law 3 years ago. By the time she was done with him, he'd lost his house, his business, and his will to live. He died in a state-run nursing home, alone and broke, while she disappeared with everything he'd worked for his entire life. I sank into the chair I'd been gripping. How did you find me? I've been tracking her for 2 years, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from me. She's very good at what she does, very careful about covering her tracks, but she has patterns, methods she uses over and over again. When I heard about a sudden death in a prominent family followed immediately by plans to move the surviving family matriarch into assisted living, I started investigating. You've been watching my family. I've been watching her, Margaret corrected. And Mrs. Whitmore, you're in immediate danger. I know she's planning to take you to tour a facility this afternoon. Once you're there, with your children present, and a sympathetic administrator who's probably been paid to cooperate, she'll spring her trap. You'll be presented with documents to sign, papers that will seem reasonable, but will actually give her complete control over your life. My heart was racing. How do you know all this? Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. Because I've been documenting everything. Claire's real name is Claire Elizabeth Price. She was born in Detroit, dropped out of high school at 16, and has been running con games ever since. She's used at least 6 different identities that I know of, and she specializes in what law enforcement calls intimate partner fraud. She targets vulnerable people, gains their trust through romantic relationships, then systematically destroys them. She spread out photographs and documents on my coffee table. This is Harold Morrison, 78 years old, lost his wife to cancer, and met Claire at a grief support group. She convinced him to sign over his power of attorney, then had him declared incompetent. He died 6 months later in a state facility. This is James Peterson, 81, a retired teacher whose children thought they were acting in his best interests when they supported Claire's recommendation to move him to assisted living. The facility she chose was run by an associate of hers. James died 3 weeks after moving in. The photographs showed men who looked lost, confused, defeated. Men who had probably been strong and independent before Claire entered their lives. You're saying she's killed people? I'm saying she's very good at creating situations where vulnerable people die conveniently, Margaret replied grimly. Medication mix-ups, falls, sudden health crises that could have been prevented with proper care. Nothing that would trigger a police investigation, but too many coincidences to ignore. I thought about Michael's intercepted heart medication, about the stress that had been building in his life, as Claire pressured him to sign documents that would have ruined the family. My son was probably her biggest challenge yet, Margaret said gently. Most of her victims are elderly people who are already isolated and vulnerable. Michael was young, healthy, smart, and suspicious. He was asking too many questions, refusing to cooperate with her plans. That made him dangerous to her operation. The implication hung in the air between us, like a physical presence. Margaret wasn't just suggesting that Claire was a con artist. She was suggesting that my son had been murdered. Why should I believe you? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Everything Margaret was telling me aligned perfectly with what I'd discovered during my sleepless night of investigation. Because deep down, you already know it's true, Margaret said. You've found evidence, haven't you? Financial irregularities, forged documents, things that don't add up. That's why you look like you haven't slept in days. That's why you're scared. I nodded slowly. I found emails between her and someone named Harrison Price. Plans to take over the business and the estate. And there's a medical power of attorney that I never signed. Harrison is her partner, Margaret confirmed. They work as a team. He handles the financial side, setting up shell companies, creating false documents, managing the money laundering. She handles the personal side, the emotional manipulation, the family dynamics, the psychological warfare. How do you know so much about their operation? Margaret's expression hardened. Because I used to be a police detective. 25 years with the Seattle PD, specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. When my brother-in-law died, I tried to get the police to investigate, but there wasn't enough evidence for a criminal case. Everything looked legal on the surface. So I started investigating on my own time. You're a police officer? Retired, she corrected. But I still have contacts, access to databases, investigative skills. I've been building a case against Claire and Harrison for 2 years, collecting evidence from all their victims. The problem is that they're very good at what they do. They're careful, methodical, and they always make sure their crimes look like family decisions made in good faith. I stared at the documents spread across my coffee table, trying to process what Margaret was telling me. If you have all this evidence, why haven't you gone to the police? I have, Margaret said grimly. Multiple times, in multiple jurisdictions. But Claire and Harrison are smart about crossing state lines, about making sure each individual crime doesn't rise to the level that would trigger a federal investigation. And honestly, law enforcement doesn't take elder abuse seriously enough. Too many cops see it as a family matter, not a criminal enterprise. So what do you want from me? I want you to help me stop them, Margaret said, leaning forward intensely. You're in a unique position, Mrs. Whitmore. Unlike their other victims, you figured out what was happening before it was too late. You still have some control over your assets, you still have legal standing, and most importantly, you have access to evidence that could finally bring them down. Quote, ... The idea was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. For the first time in days, I felt something other than helpless despair. What would I have to do? First, you need to not go to that tour this afternoon, Margaret said. Claire is probably frantic right now, wondering why you're not answering your phone and why you're not ready to go. That's good. We want her off balance. As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Claire's number. Don't answer it, Margaret advised. Let her wonder what's happening. Let her start to worry that her plan is falling apart. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Almost immediately, it started ringing again. She's persistent, I observed. She's desperate, Margaret corrected. This is the culmination of months of planning. She's invested too much time and effort in this scam to let it fall apart now. That desperation is going to make her sloppy, and we can use that against her. My phone buzzed with a text message from Claire. Eleanor, where are you? I'm at your house and you're not here. David and Rachel are already at Sunset Manor waiting for us. Please call me immediately. She's lying, Margaret said, reading the message over my shoulder. David and Rachel aren't at Sunset Manor yet. I've been monitoring their phones. They're both still at work. Claire is trying to create urgency, make you feel like you're disappointing your children. You're monitoring my children's phones. I'm a former police detective investigating a criminal conspiracy, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. Yes, I'm monitoring communications between the suspects and potential witnesses. It's all legal under the circumstances. Another text arrived. I'm very concerned about you. You seemed confused this morning. I'm coming back to check on you. We need to leave, Margaret said, standing up quickly. If she comes back and finds us together, it could be dangerous. She's already killed at least 4 people that I can prove, possibly more. If she realizes you're working with someone who can expose her operation, she might decide to accelerate her timeline dramatically. The casual way Margaret mentioned murder made my blood run cold. Where can we go? My hotel, Margaret said, gathering up her documents. I've been staying at the Mountain View Inn under an assumed name. We can talk freely there. and I can show you the full extent of what I've uncovered about Claire's operation. I hesitated. Walking out of my house with a stranger, even one who seemed to have answers to all my questions, felt like a huge leap of faith. But staying here, waiting for Claire to return and continue her psychological assault, felt like surrendering to inevitable defeat. "What about my children?" I asked. "They'll be worried if I don't show up for the tour." "Your children have been manipulated by a professional con artist," Margaret reminded me. "Right now, they think they're acting in your best interests. Once we expose Claire's lies, they'll understand that they were being used." Another text from Claire, this one more urgent. "Eleanor, I'm on my way back to your house. If you don't answer your phone, I'm going to assume you've had a medical emergency and call 911. "That's a threat," Margaret said grimly. "She's telling you that if you don't cooperate, she'll have you taken to a hospital where she can claim you're having a psychiatric crisis. With her forged power of attorney, she could have you committed involuntarily." The walls were closing in. If I stayed, Claire would return, and probably find a way to have me institutionalized immediately. If I left with Margaret, I was trusting my life to someone I'd just met, based on nothing more than her claims and some documents that could have been fabricated. But Margaret had known about Claire's real name, about the conspiracy with Harrison Price, about details that she couldn't have known unless she was telling the truth. And more importantly, she was offering me something I hadn't had in days. Hope. "All right," I said, grabbing my purse and a jacket. "Let's go." As we headed toward Margaret's truck, my phone rang again. This time it was David. "Mom, where are you?" he asked when I answered. "Claire said you were supposed to meet her an hour ago, but you're not at home, and you're not answering your phone. She's really worried about you." "I'm fine, David," I said, climbing into the passenger seat of Margaret's truck. "I just needed some time to think, so I went for a drive." "A drive?" "Mom, you seemed really confused this morning when Claire talked to you. Are you sure you should be driving?" More gaslighting, even from my own son. "I'm perfectly capable of driving, David. I've been driving for over 50 years. "I know, but..." "Look, Claire is really concerned that you might be having some kind of episode. She said you seemed disoriented this morning, and now you're missing important appointments. Maybe we should have Dr. Patterson take a look at you, just to make sure everything's okay." The suggestion sent chills down my spine. Dr. Patterson was Michael's cardiologist, the same doctor whose treatment recommendations had been sabotaged by someone claiming to be, quote, Mrs. Whitmore. If Claire had gotten to him, convinced him that I was having mental health issues, he could be the doctor who signed the papers declaring me incompetent. "I don't need to see a doctor," I said firmly. "I need you to trust that I'm capable of making my own decisions." "Mom, no one's questioning your ability to make decisions," David said, but there was doubt in his voice. "We're just worried about you. This is a really stressful time, and sometimes stress can affect people's judgment, especially at your age." At your age. The phrase that had become Claire's favorite weapon, now being wielded by my own son. "I'll call you later," I said, and hung up before David could protest further. Margaret was already driving down the mountain road, taking the turns with the skill of someone familiar with the terrain. "That went better than I expected," she said. "Usually by this point, the family has completely turned against the victim." "I think they have," I said bitterly. "David thinks I'm having some kind of mental breakdown." "David thinks he's protecting his mother from herself," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference. Once he understands what's really happening, he'll be your strongest ally." What if you're wrong? What if Claire really is just a concerned daughter-in-law, and I'm just a paranoid old woman who's lost her mind? Margaret glanced at me, her expression serious. "Do you really believe that?" I thought about everything I'd discovered in the past 24 hours. The forged signatures, the intercepted medical care, the systematic financial sabotage, the carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. "No," I said finally. "I don't." "Then trust your instincts," Margaret said. "Claire is counting on you to doubt yourself, to surrender your judgment to people who claim to know better. The moment you stop trusting your own perceptions, you become completely vulnerable to her manipulation. Quote, ... We drove in silence for a few minutes, winding down the mountain road toward town. I watched the familiar landscape pass by, the dense forest, the rocky outcroppings, the glimpses of valley below, and wondered if this might be the last time I'd see it as a free woman. If Margaret was wrong, if this was all some kind of elaborate delusion, I might be making the biggest mistake of my life. But if Margaret was right, if Claire really was a professional con artist who had murdered my son and was planning to destroy me, then this truck ride might be my only chance at salvation. Tell me about the others, I said finally. Claire's other victims. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Harold Morrison was the first one I was able to document thoroughly. He was a retired engineer, lost his wife of 48 years to pancreatic cancer. Claire met him at a grief counseling group, presented herself as a widow who was struggling with similar losses. She was patient with him, took months to build trust, helped him with practical matters like managing his finances and maintaining his house. That doesn't sound sinister. It wasn't, at first. But gradually she started isolating him from his friends and his adult children. She convinced him that they were just waiting for him to die so they could inherit his money. She planted seeds of doubt about everyone in his life, except her. By the time she convinced him to marry her, he was completely dependent on her emotionally and practically. The parallels to my own situation were chilling. What happened to his children? They tried to intervene, tried to warn him that Claire was manipulating him. But by then, Claire had convinced Harold that his children were greedy and selfish, that they were trying to control him because they thought he was senile. He cut them out of his will and signed over power of attorney to Claire. And then Harold started having accidents. Falls down the stairs, medication mix-ups, confusion that seemed to come and go. Claire used each incident as evidence that he needed more intensive care, more supervision. She moved him to a facility that was supposedly for his own safety, but was actually run by her associates. I thought about the Sunset Manor tour I was supposed to be attending right now. What kind of facility? The kind where patients die conveniently and no one asks too many questions, Margaret said grimly. The kind where staff are paid to look the other way when medications are switched or when patients have unexplained falls. Harold lasted 6 months after Claire had him committed. The official cause of death was heart failure, but I believe he was murdered. The casual way she said it still shocked me. You really think Claire is a killer? I think Claire is someone who sees human beings as resources to be exploited, Margaret replied. If keeping them alive serves her purposes, she keeps them alive. If they become inconvenient or dangerous to her operation, she finds ways to eliminate them that look natural. We were approaching the outskirts of town now, passing the shopping centers and suburban developments that had grown up around the original mountain community. The Mountain View Inn was a modest 2-story building that catered to tourists and business travelers, the kind of place where you could pay cash and not attract attention. One more question, I said as Margaret pulled into the parking lot. Why are you doing this? If you're right about Claire being dangerous, why are you risking your life to stop her? Margaret turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Because someone has to, she said finally. Because the system failed my brother-in-law and all her other victims. Because she's still out there, still destroying families, still getting away with murder. She turned to look at me, and I saw something fierce and determined in her eyes. And because I made a promise to Harold Morrison's daughter that I would find a way to make Claire pay for what she did. This is my chance to keep that promise. As we walked toward the hotel entrance, I realized that for the first time in days, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel helpless. I felt like I had a chance to fight back, to protect my family's legacy, to get justice for Michael. But I also realized that I was about to declare war against someone who had proven she was willing to kill to protect her operation. The next few hours were going to determine whether I lived to see justice done, or whether I became another casualty in Claire's campaign of systematic destruction. Either way, there was no turning back now. Margaret's hotel room looked like a detective's war room. Every available surface was covered with documents, photographs, timelines, and maps. Red string connected various pieces of evidence on a large corkboard mounted on the wall, creating a web of connections that told the story of Claire's criminal enterprise. It was overwhelming and terrifying and oddly reassuring all at once. "Welcome to my obsession," Margaret said wryly, gesturing around the room. "I've been living and breathing this case for 2 years." I stood in the doorway, taking it all in. There were photographs of Claire with different men, using different names, in different cities. Financial documents showing patterns of theft and fraud. Medical records that had been altered or falsified. Death certificates for people who had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after encountering Claire. "How many people has she killed?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "That I can prove. 4, possibly 5, Margaret replied, moving to her laptop. "But I suspect there are more. She's been refining her methods for years, getting better at choosing victims who won't be missed, at creating deaths that look natural, at covering her tracks." She pulled up a file on her computer. "This is where it gets really disturbing. Claire doesn't just steal money, she destroys entire family legacies. She targets people whose deaths will benefit her financially, but she also seems to enjoy the psychological destruction. She likes breaking people down, making them doubt their own sanity, turning their loved ones against them." I sank into the room's only chair, feeling overwhelmed. Why would someone do that? "Because she's a psychopath," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the clinical sense. She has no empathy. No genuine emotional connections. No conscience. Other people exist only as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated." She handed me a thick folder. "This is everything I've compiled about Claire's background. Her real name is Claire Elizabeth Price. She was born in Detroit in 1985, which makes her younger than she appears. Her mother was a drug addict who died when Claire was 12. Her father was unknown. She spent her teenage years in foster care and juvenile detention facilities." I opened the folder and found myself looking at school records, police reports, and psychological evaluations. Even as a teenager, Claire had shown signs of manipulative behavior and a complete lack of remorse for her actions. "She dropped out of high school at 16 and started running small-time cons," Margaret continued. "Credit card fraud, identity theft, romance scams. She was arrested several times but never served serious jail time because she was good at manipulating the system, presenting herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The progression from petty criminal to serial killer was laid out in chilling detail. Claire had spent years perfecting her techniques, learning how to identify vulnerable targets, how to gain their trust, how to isolate them from their support systems. She'd studied psychology and law enforcement techniques, not to help people but to better exploit them. The intimate partner fraud started about 8 years ago, Margaret explained, pointing to a timeline on the wall. She realized that romantic relationships gave her access to people's financial information and emotional vulnerabilities in ways that other cons couldn't match. She also discovered that if she could convince families that she was acting in their loved ones' best interests, she could get away with almost anything. How did she learn to forge documents so well? "Practice and professional help," Margaret replied. Harrison Price, her partner, used to work for a document verification company before he turned criminal. He taught her how to create convincing forgeries, how to manipulate official records, how to make fraudulent documents look legitimate. I thought about the medical power of attorney I'd found in Michael's files, about how convincing it had looked despite being completely fake. "What's Harrison's role in all this?" Margaret pulled out another file. "Harrison handles the technical side, creating shell companies, laundering money, maintaining false identities. He's also the one who researches potential targets, identifies their financial vulnerabilities, and maps out their family dynamics. Claire couldn't operate without him." The photograph in the file showed a man in his 50s, balding and nondescript, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. But his eyes were cold and calculating, reminding me of Claire's predatory stare. "They met in prison," Margaret continued. "Claire was serving 6 months for credit card fraud. Harrison was doing 2 years for embezzlement. They bonded over their shared contempt for their victims and their belief that they were smarter than law enforcement. If you have all this evidence, why haven't they been arrested? Margaret's expression darkened. Because they're very good at what they do, and because the system isn't designed to handle this kind of crime. Each individual fraud is committed in a different state, making it hard to establish patterns. The victims are usually elderly people whose families don't want to believe they were fooled, so they don't press charges. And the deaths look natural, so there's no murder investigation. She moved to another section of the wall, where she'd mapped out Claire's movements over the past 8 years. She spends about 18 months with each victim, gradually taking control of their finances and isolating them from their families. By the time she's ready to move on, there's usually no one left who would question the victim's decision to change their will or sign over power of attorney. But Michael questioned it. Michael was different, Margaret agreed. He was young, suspicious, and he had access to business records that showed the financial irregularities. He was also emotionally strong enough to resist Claire's manipulation. That made him dangerous to her operation. The implication hung between us like a physical presence. You really think she killed him? I think she arranged for him to die, Margaret said carefully. Intercepting his heart medication was just the beginning. I've been reviewing his medical records, and there are signs that someone was systematically sabotaging his health care for months. She showed me printouts of medical insurance claims. Look at this pattern. Appointments canceled at the last minute, prescriptions that were never filled, test results that were quote, lost, and had to be repeated. Someone was making sure that Michael's heart condition went untreated while he was under increasing stress from Claire's business manipulations. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. How long have you known about my family? I've been tracking Claire for 6 months, Margaret admitted. I knew she was targeting someone wealthy in this area, but I didn't know who until I started seeing the signs. Sudden death, family pressure to institutionalize the survivor, rushed decisions about selling property. That's when I started investigating your family specifically. You've been watching us? Quote, ... I've been gathering evidence, Margaret corrected. I monitored Claire's communications with Harrison Price, tracked her financial transactions, documented her interactions with your family. I was hoping to gather enough evidence to prevent what happened to my brother-in-law from happening to you. The scope of Margaret's investigation was staggering. She had surveillance photos, recorded conversations, financial records, medical documents, everything needed to build a criminal case against Claire and Harrison. But she was right about one thing. It would be nearly impossible to get law enforcement to take the case seriously without a victim who was willing and able to testify. That's where you come in, Margaret said, as if reading my thoughts. You're still competent, you still have legal standing, and you have access to evidence that I can't get legally. With your cooperation, we can finally build a case that will put Claire and Harrison in prison for the rest of their lives. My phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Rachel this time. Mom, where are you? She demanded when I answered. Claire is frantic. She says you missed your appointment at Sunset Manor, and now you're not answering your phone. David and I are really worried about you. I'm fine, Rachel, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I just decided I wasn't ready to tour the facility today. Mom, that's exactly what we're worried about, Rachel said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that had become so familiar. You're not thinking clearly. You're making impulsive decisions that don't make sense. Claire thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. Claire thinks a lot of things, I said, letting some of my anger show. That doesn't make them true. Mom, you're scaring us. First, you disappeared without telling anyone where you were going. Now you're talking like you don't trust the people who are trying to help you. This isn't like you. Wasn't it? Or was this exactly like me? The woman who had survived the Great Depression, who had helped build a successful business, who had raised 3 children and managed a household, and never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do, I said. Mom, please, Rachel's voice was pleading now. Just come home. Let us help you. Let Dr. Patterson examine you. just to make sure everything is okay. We love you and we're worried about you." The mention of Dr. Patterson sent chills down my spine. Margaret had been right. They were planning to have me declared incompetent by a doctor who might already be compromised by Claire's manipulation. "I'll call you later," I said, and hung up before Rachel could respond. Margaret had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing concern. "They're escalating faster than I expected," she said. "Claire must be panicking about losing control of the situation." "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need to move quickly," Margaret replied grimly. "If Claire decides you're too dangerous to her operation, she might take more drastic measures to neutralize the threat you represent." The casual way she talked about neutralizing threats made my blood run cold. "You mean she might try to kill me?" "I mean she might try to have you committed involuntarily," Margaret said. "With the forged power of attorney and a cooperative doctor, she could have you institutionalized within hours. Once you're locked up in a psychiatric facility, drugged and isolated, no one will believe anything you say about her crimes." The thought of being trapped in an institution, helpless and medicated, while Claire systematically destroyed everything my family had built, was more terrifying than the prospect of death. At least if I died, the truth might eventually come out. If I was declared insane, I'd be buried alive while Claire got away with murder. "So what do we do?" Margaret moved to her laptop and started typing rapidly. "First, we document everything you've discovered about Claire's activities. I need copies of all the evidence you found in Michael's office, the emails, the financial records, the medical documents. Then we contact my allies in law enforcement and see if we can get someone to take the case seriously." "What allies?" "Former colleagues, FBI agents who specialize in financial crimes, prosecutors who've dealt with elder abuse cases. The key is finding someone who understands that this isn't just family drama, it's organized crime." While Margaret worked on her computer, I called my own lawyer, Harold Morrison. Despite his age, Harold had always been sharp and reliable. If anyone could help me protect my legal interests, it would be him. "Eleanor." Harold's voice was warm with genuine concern when he answered. "I just heard about Michael. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man, a credit to his father's legacy." "Thank you, Harold," I said, feeling tears threaten for the first time since this nightmare began. Harold had known Michael since he was a baby, had watched him grow up, had been proud of his business success. His grief felt real in a way that Claire's performance never had. "What can I do for you?" Harold asked. "I imagine there are estate matters that need to be addressed." "Actually, I need your help with something else," I said. "I've discovered some irregularities in Michael's business affairs, and I'm concerned that someone may have been manipulating him financially." There was a pause. "What kind of irregularities?" I gave Harold a brief overview of what I'd found. The forged signatures, the unauthorized loans, the systematic embezzlement. I didn't mention Margaret or the larger conspiracy theory, just the concrete evidence of financial fraud. "Eleanor, these are serious allegations," Harold said when I finished. "If what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about criminal activity that needs to be reported to law enforcement." "I'm worried about more than just the business," I continued. "I think someone may have forged my signature on a medical power of attorney document, and my children are being pressured to have me move to assisted living based on false information about my competence and financial situation." Another pause, longer this time. "Eleanor, I have to ask, are you certain about these accusations?" Grief can sometimes cause people to see conspiracies where none exist, and the stress of losing a child can affect judgment in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Even Harold was questioning my sanity. The gaslighting had been so effective that even people who had known me for decades were willing to believe I might be having delusions rather than uncovering fraud. "Harold, I've known you for 40 years, I said firmly. In all that time, have I ever been prone to paranoia or flights of fancy?" "No," he admitted. "You've always been one of the most level-headed people I know." "Then please, trust me now. Something is very wrong here, and I need your help to sort it out." "All right," Harold said finally. "Bring me whatever evidence you have, and I'll review it objectively. If there's substance to your concerns, we'll figure out the best way to address them legally." After I hung up, Margaret looked up from her computer. How did that go? Quote, ... Better than expected, I said. Harold's willing to look at the evidence, even though he's clearly concerned about my mental state. That's a start, Margaret said. But Eleanor, there's something else we need to discuss. If we're going to build a criminal case against Claire, you're going to have to be willing to testify against her in court. That means exposing yourself to cross-examination by defense attorneys who will try to make you look confused, unreliable, or mentally incompetent. The prospect was daunting. What if they succeed? What if a jury thinks I'm just a delusional old woman? Then Claire gets away with murder, and she moves on to her next victim, Margaret said bluntly. But Eleanor, you're not delusional. You're sharp, articulate, and you have documentary evidence to support your claims. More importantly, you're the only person who can speak for Michael and all of Claire's other victims. I thought about my son, about the man he'd been, and the life he'd planned to live. I thought about Harold Morrison and James Peterson and all the other people whose stories would never be told if Claire wasn't stopped. I thought about the families who would be destroyed if she was allowed to continue her campaign of systematic destruction. What do I need to do? Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd met her. First, we go back to your house and collect all the evidence you found. Then we make copies of everything and store them in multiple secure locations. After that, we start building the timeline that will show exactly how Claire orchestrated Michael's death and planned your destruction. What if Claire is there when we go back? Then we call the police and have her arrested for trespassing, Margaret replied. She has no legal right to be in your house without your permission, regardless of what keys she might have. The thought of confronting Claire directly was terrifying, but it was also oddly liberating. For days, I'd been the victim, reacting to her manipulations and schemes. Now, finally, I was going to take action. There's one more thing, Margaret said, her expression serious. Once we start this process, there's no going back. Claire will realize that you're actively working against her, and she'll escalate her efforts to neutralize you. Things are going to get much more dangerous before they get better. Quote, ... I thought about my alternative. Surrendering to Claire's plan, allowing myself to be institutionalized, watching helplessly as she destroyed my family's legacy and moved on to her next victim. That wasn't really a choice at all. I understand, I said. What choice do I have? You always have a choice, Margaret replied. You can walk away right now, go home, pretend this conversation never happened, accept whatever Claire has planned for you, and hope it won't be too painful. That's not a choice, I said firmly. That's surrender. Margaret nodded approvingly. Then let's go to war. As we prepared to leave the hotel room, I realized that I was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. I was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, grieving widow and convenient victim. I was Eleanor Whitmore, crime fighter and seeker of justice. At 73, I was about to embark on the most dangerous adventure of my life, but for the first time in days, I felt like myself again. The woman who had survived the Great Depression, who had helped build a successful business, who had raised 3 children and never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake. Claire Price had made a serious mistake when she'd targeted my family. She'd assumed that because I was old, I would be easy to manipulate and destroy. She'd underestimated the fierce protective instincts of a mother whose child had been murdered. Now she was going to learn that some old women don't go quietly into the darkness. Some of us fight back, and when we do, we fight to win. The drive back to Whitmore Estate felt different this time. Instead of returning to a house full of memories and regrets, I was returning to the scene of a crime with evidence to collect and justice to pursue. Margaret followed behind me in her truck, ready to provide backup if Claire tried to interfere with our investigation. But as we turned into my driveway, I could see that Claire's Mercedes was gone. The house looked empty, almost abandoned, with an air of waiting that suggested significant changes were coming. Good, Margaret said as we got out of our vehicles. This will be easier without having to deal with her directly. As I unlocked the front door of my own house, a house I'd been forced to flee just hours earlier, I felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. I was back, I was armed with knowledge and allies, and I was ready to fight for everything I held dear. Claire Price had started this war when she'd targeted my family. But I was going to finish it, and I was going to win. The next 3 weeks became a whirlwind of investigation, documentation, and careful planning. Margaret and I worked together like a well-oiled machine, gathering evidence and building what she called an ironclad case against Claire and Harrison Price. But it wasn't just about collecting documents. It was about staying one step ahead of Claire's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the situation. The first breakthrough came when Harold Morrison reviewed the evidence I'd collected from Michael's office. Despite his initial skepticism about my mental state, Harold was a sharp lawyer who recognized criminal activity when he saw it. "Eleanor, this is worse than I initially thought," he said during our meeting at his downtown office. "These aren't just financial irregularities. This is a systematic criminal enterprise. The forged signatures alone constitute multiple felonies, and the medical power of attorney is clear evidence of identity fraud." Harold had been joined by his younger associate Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in elder abuse cases. Jennifer had taken one look at Margaret's documentation and immediately recognized the patterns. "This is intimate partner fraud on a massive scale," Jennifer said, spreading out photographs and documents across Harold's conference table. "I've seen cases like this before, but never with this level of sophistication. Most financial predators target isolated elderly people who don't have family support. Claire was bold enough to target a prominent family with multiple adult children. She was counting on our age and grief to make us vulnerable," I said. "She assumed that my children would automatically support her recommendations because they'd been conditioned to see me as frail and incompetent." "It almost worked," Harold admitted grimly. "If you hadn't discovered those emails between Claire and Harrison Price, she probably would have succeeded in having you institutionalized within days." Margaret had been quietly listening to our conversation, but now she leaned forward with an intensity that reminded me of a hunting predator. "The question is, what do we do now? I've been building this case for 2 years, but I need victims who are willing and able to testify. Eleanor is the first person who's both competent enough to be believed and brave enough to fight back." "What about involving law enforcement?" Jennifer asked. "I've tried," Margaret replied, "multiple times, in multiple jurisdictions. The problem is that Claire and Harrison are very good at making their crimes look like legitimate family decisions. Elder abuse cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victims appear to have willing signed documents giving away their rights." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "But this case is different. Eleanor discovered the fraud before it was completed, and she has documentary evidence of the conspiracy. More importantly, she's competent to testify on her own behalf." "There's something else," I added. "Claire has been getting more aggressive in her attempts to have me declared incompetent. Yesterday, she convinced David to schedule an appointment with Dr. Patterson for a quote, 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 that I'm certain is actually intended to provide grounds for a mental competency evaluation." Margaret's expression darkened. "That's exactly what she did to Harold Morrison. She arranged for him to see a doctor who was either corrupt or incompetent, got a diagnosis of early dementia, then used that to justify taking control of his affairs." "We need to move fast," Jennifer said. "If Claire succeeds in having Eleanor declared incompetent, it will be much harder to build a criminal case." That's when Harold surprised me. "Actually, I think we should let her try." "What?" I stared at him in shock. "Think about it," Harold continued, his old lawyer's mind working through the possibilities. "If we can document Claire's attempt to manipulate a medical evaluation, that becomes evidence of fraud and conspiracy. We set up surveillance, record the conversations, catch her in the act of bribing or threatening medical professionals." Margaret was nodding slowly. "It's risky, but it could work. If we can prove that Claire is actively attempting to have Eleanor falsely declared incompetent, that becomes the centerpiece of our criminal case." "What if the doctor actually declares me incompetent?" I asked. "Then we challenge the evaluation immediately," Jennifer replied. "We demand a second opinion from a physician of our choosing, and we use the surveillance evidence to show that the first evaluation was tainted by fraud." The plan was audacious and terrifying, but it also offered the best chance of exposing Claire's entire operation. Over the next week, We carefully orchestrated what amounted to a sting operation. Margaret used her law enforcement contacts to arrange for professional surveillance of Dr. Patterson's office. Harold prepared legal documents that would allow him to immediately challenge any competency evaluation. Jennifer researched the doctor's background and discovered that he was struggling financially. Exactly the kind of person who might be vulnerable to Claire's manipulation. Meanwhile, I had to continue playing the role of a confused, grieving widow who was slowly succumbing to Claire's psychological pressure. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do, pretending to be helpless while actually working to expose her crimes. The appointment with Dr. Patterson was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. David insisted on driving me, despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of driving myself. Claire, of course, planned to accompany us for moral support. "I'm just so worried about you, Eleanor," she said as we sat in Dr. Patterson's waiting room. "You've been acting so strangely since Michael's death. Disappearing without explanation, refusing to answer your phone, making irrational decisions about your living situation." David nodded. Along with everything she said, his face creased with genuine concern. "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay. If there's a medical explanation for the confusion you've been experiencing, we can get you the help you need." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. If only David knew that the confusion he was worried about was actually the clearest thinking I'd done in years. Dr. Patterson was a thin, nervous man in his early 60s who seemed uncomfortable from the moment we entered his office. He avoided eye contact and kept checking his watch, as if he had somewhere else he'd rather be. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, consulting a file that I was certain had been prepared in advance. "Your family has expressed some concerns about your mental state following your recent loss. I understand you've been experiencing memory problems and making some questionable decisions." "Have I?" I asked innocently. I hadn't noticed any problems. "Well, that's often the case with early-stage dementia," Dr. Patterson said, still not meeting my eyes. "Patients frequently don't recognize their own symptoms." Claire leaned forward in her chair. "Doctor, she's been disappearing for hours at a time without telling anyone where she's going. She missed an important appointment at an assisted living facility. She's been talking about conspiracy theories and accusing family members of lying to her." Every word was carefully chosen to make me sound paranoid and delusional. But I could see Margaret's surveillance equipment recording everything from across the street, and I knew that Harold was in the building's parking lot with legal documents ready to be filed. Dr. Patterson proceeded with what was clearly a predetermined script rather than a genuine medical evaluation. His questions were leading and biased, designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as signs of cognitive decline. When I answered his questions clearly and rationally, he seemed frustrated. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to recommend that you undergo some additional testing," he said finally. "Based on what I've observed today, combined with the concerns your family has expressed, I believe there's reason to worry about your cognitive function." "What kind of testing?" I asked. "Psychological evaluation, memory assessment, perhaps some brain imaging studies. In the meantime, I'm going to recommend that your family consider taking a more active role in managing your daily affairs." Claire was practically vibrating with satisfaction. This was exactly what she'd been hoping for. Medical justification for taking control of my life. But Dr. Patterson wasn't finished. "In fact, given the severity of my concerns, I'm prepared to sign a statement recommending that Mrs. Whitmore be placed under immediate medical supervision." That was when Harold walked into the office. "Excuse me," he said calmly, showing his identification to the startled doctor. "I'm Harold Morrison, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney. I'm here to inform you that this medical evaluation is being conducted under false pretenses, and that any documentation you provide will be challenged in court." Dr. Patterson went pale. "I don't understand. This is a routine medical appointment." "No, it's not," Harold replied, handing him a legal document. "This is a conspiracy to defraud an elderly woman of her civil rights through fraudulent medical certification. You're being served with notice that any attempt to declare Mrs. Whitmore incompetent will be met with immediate legal action." Claire jumped to her feet. "What is this? Harold, what are you doing here?" "I'm protecting my client from criminal conspiracy," Harold said calmly. "And I'm placing you on notice that your activities have been documented and will be reported to law enforcement." The office erupted in chaos. David was demanding explanations, Claire was threatening lawsuits, and Dr. Patterson was frantically trying to understand what was happening. But I sat calmly in my chair, finally able to drop the pretense of confusion and frailty. "The game is over, Claire," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the noise. "I know who you really are. I know what you did to Michael. And I know about Harold Morrison, James Peterson, and all the other people you've murdered." Claire's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the cold, calculating predator beneath the concerned daughter-in-law facade. "You're delusional," she said, but there was panic in her voice. "David, your mother is having a psychotic episode. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." "Actually, we need to get you to a police station," Margaret said, appearing in the doorway with 2 uniformed officers. "Claire Price, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and multiple counts of murder." The next hour was a blur of handcuffs, Miranda rights, and shocked explanations. David stood frozen in the corner of Dr. Patterson's office, trying to process the fact that his sister-in-law was actually a serial killer who had murdered his brother. Dr. Patterson was desperately trying to explain to the police that he'd been pressured into conducting a fraudulent evaluation. But for me, it was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when justice finally arrived for Michael and all of Claire's other victims. The trial took place 6 months later. By then, Margaret's investigation had uncovered evidence linking Claire and Harrison Price to at least 7 murders across 4 states. The prosecution's case was built around the detailed documentation we'd gathered, the surveillance recordings from Dr. Patterson's office, and my testimony about discovering Claire's conspiracy. Claire's defense attorneys tried exactly what Margaret had predicted. They portrayed me as a confused elderly woman whose grief had driven her to paranoid delusions about her loving daughter-in-law. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony was clear and compelling. "Mrs. Whitmore," the prosecutor asked during my time on the witness stand, "can you tell the jury why you decided to investigate your daughter-in-law's activities?" "Because I knew my son," I replied, looking directly at Claire across the courtroom. "I knew he would never have made the financial decisions that appeared to bear his signature. I knew he would never have ignored his doctor's advice about heart medication. And I knew that his death was too convenient for someone who had been trying to steal our family's assets for months." "What made you realize that Claire Whitmore wasn't who she claimed to be?" "When I found the emails between her and Harrison Price, I realized that everything she'd told our family was a lie. Her grief was performed, her concern was calculated, and her love was completely fake. She saw my son as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated, and our family as resources to be exploited." Claire was convicted on all counts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts for conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and 7 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Harrison Price was arrested 3 days after Claire's conviction, trying to board a plane to a non-extradition country with a suitcase full of cash and fake identification documents. He eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to consecutive life terms. But the real victory wasn't just seeing Claire and Harrison in prison, it was the restoration of my family. David and Rachel were devastated when they learned the truth about Claire's deception. They'd been manipulated by a professional con artist who had spent months studying their psychological vulnerabilities and exploiting their love for their mother. "Mom, I'm so sorry," David said during one of our first conversations after the trial. "I should have trusted you. I should have listened when you tried to tell me something was wrong." "You were trying to protect me," I replied. Claire was very good at making her manipulation look like love and concern. Even I started to doubt myself toward the end. Rachel was even more emotional. "I can't believe I almost helped her put you in that place," she sobbed. "I thought I was being a good daughter, but I was actually helping a killer destroy our family." "But you didn't," I reminded her. "When it mattered most, we came together as a family and stopped her. That's what counts." The Whitmore estate became a family home again, rather than a target for exploitation. David and Rachel both moved back to help me manage the property. Not because they thought I was incompetent, but because they wanted to be part of preserving our family's legacy. Michael's construction business was restored to financial health once Claire's embezzlement was discovered, and the stolen money was recovered. We decided to run it as a family operation, with David handling the administrative side and Rachel managing client relations while I provided strategic oversight. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the impact our case had on law enforcement's approach to elder abuse. Margaret's meticulous documentation and our successful prosecution created a template that other jurisdictions began using to identify and prosecute similar crimes. "You've probably saved hundreds of lives," Margaret told me during the 6-month anniversary of Claire's conviction. "Other families won't have to go through what yours did because now law enforcement knows what to look for." Margaret had become more than just an ally in the fight against Claire. She'd become a genuine friend. We'd bonded over our shared experience of being underestimated because of our age and our determination to see justice done regardless of the personal cost. "What's next for you?" I asked her as we sat on the terrace of the Whitmore estate, looking out over the mountains where I'd almost lost everything. "I'm thinking about starting a consulting business," Margaret replied. "Help families identify financial predators before they can do too much damage. Teach people how to recognize the warning signs of intimate partner fraud." "That sounds perfect," I said. "And you'll always have a place here if you need a home base for your operations." As we sat together in the evening light, I reflected on everything that had happened since that terrible day at Michael's funeral reception. I'd gone from being a grieving widow targeted for destruction to being a crime fighter who had helped expose a serial killer. I'd discovered strength I didn't know I possessed and found allies in the most unexpected places. Most importantly, I'd learned that age doesn't have to mean vulnerability. Experience and wisdom are powerful weapons against those who would exploit and destroy. At 73, I'd proven that some old women don't go quietly into the darkness. Some of us fight back. And when we do, we fight to win. Claire Price had made the mistake of assuming that because I was old, I would be easy to defeat. She'd underestimated the fierce protective instincts of a mother whose child had been murdered and the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades of life experience. Now she was spending the rest of her life in prison, while I was free to enjoy my golden years surrounded by family who loved and respected me. My house was once again filled with laughter and love instead of manipulation and fear. The Whitmore legacy was secure, and Michael's memory was honored not just by catching his killer, but by proving that his mother was every bit as strong and determined as the son she'd raised. At the estate, I felt exactly where I was supposed to be, not as an outsider being pushed toward exile, but as the matriarch of a family that had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. Some stories end with the protagonist finding their place in the world. Mine ended with me defending the place I'd never really lost, surrounded by people who finally understood that home isn't just where you're comfortable, it's where you're willing to fight for everything you hold dear. And in that fight, at 73 years old, I'd discovered that I was exactly who I was always supposed to be. Eleanor Whitmore, defender of family, seeker of justice, and prove that age is just a number when you have truth on your side and love worth fighting for. The woman who had once been seen as a burden to be managed had become the hero of her own story. And that story was far from over. 3 years had passed since Claire Price's conviction, and the Whitmore estate had never felt more like home. As I sat in my favorite chair on the wraparound porch, watching my grandson Tommy chase butterflies through the garden, while his parents, David and his new wife Sarah, prepared lunch in the kitchen, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed since that terrible day when my children had tried to ship me off to Sunset Manor. The estate itself had been transformed. What Claire had seen as a crumbling money pit, requiring expensive repairs, had become a thriving family compound. David had moved his dental practice to town and converted the carriage house into a satellite office, allowing him to work from home several days a week. Rachel had established the headquarters of her catering business in the renovated guest cottage, and the estate's commercial kitchen now produced wedding cakes and gourmet meals for clients throughout the mountain region. But the most significant change was in me. At 76, I wasn't the grieving widow who had nearly been destroyed by a criminal conspiracy. I was Eleanor Whitmore, co-founder of the Whitmore Foundation for Elder Justice, keynote speaker at law enforcement conferences, and the author of a best-selling memoir titled The Fight of My Life: How One Grandmother Took Down a Serial Killer. The memoir had been Margaret's idea. "You need to tell your story," she'd insisted during one of our weekly strategy meetings for the foundation. There are thousands of families out there facing similar situations, and they need to know that fighting back is possible. Margaret had been right, as usual. The book had struck a chord with readers across the country, particularly older women who had felt dismissed and underestimated by their own families. I'd received thousands of letters from people who had recognized the warning signs of financial fraud in their own lives and taken action to protect themselves. "Mrs. Whitmore," one letter had read, "your book saved my life. My daughter's boyfriend was pressuring me to sign over power of attorney, and I was starting to think maybe I really was too old to manage my own affairs. Reading about your experience gave me the courage to investigate, and I discovered he was planning to steal my retirement savings. Thank you for showing me that being old doesn't mean being helpless." The foundation had grown from Margaret's and my shared desire to prevent other families from experiencing what we'd been through. We'd started with a simple website offering resources about elder abuse and financial fraud. Now we had a staff of 12, including former law enforcement officers, social workers, and attorneys who specialized in protecting vulnerable adults. Our biggest success had been the development of what we called the Whitmore Protocol, a standardized approach for law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate cases of intimate partner fraud targeting elderly victims. The protocol had been adopted by police departments in 37 states and had led to the conviction of dozens of financial predators who might otherwise have escaped justice. "Grandma Eleanor, look what I found," Tommy's voice interrupted my reflections. My 4-year-old grandson came running up the porch steps, clutching something carefully in his small hands. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked, setting aside the foundation reports I'd been reviewing. He opened his hands to reveal a caterpillar, green and fuzzy and very much alive. "Daddy says it's going to turn into a butterfly, but I don't believe him." "How can something that crawls become something that flies?" I smiled, remembering asking my own grandmother similar questions when I was Tommy's age. "It seems impossible, doesn't it? But sometimes the most amazing transformations happen when we least expect them." "Will you help me make a house for it?" Tommy asked. "So we can watch it change?" "Of course," I said, standing up with only a slight twinge from the arthritis that reminded me daily that I was no longer young. "We'll build the best caterpillar house in the mountains." As we walked toward the garden shed to find materials for our project, I reflected on the irony of Tommy's question. 3 years ago, I'd been like that caterpillar, trapped in a situation that seemed hopeless, surrounded by people who saw me as a burden rather than a person with untapped potential. My transformation hadn't involved a cocoon, but it had been every bit as dramatic as a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. The legal aftermath of Claire's conviction had been complex and emotionally draining. The civil lawsuits to recover the stolen assets had taken 2 years to resolve, complicated by the fact that Claire and Harrison had hidden money in shell companies and offshore accounts. But Harold Morrison and Jennifer Walsh had been relentless in their pursuit of justice, eventually recovering nearly everything that had been stolen from our family and Claire's other victims. More challenging had been the emotional recovery. David and Rachel had both undergone therapy to process the guilt and trauma of being manipulated into betraying their own mother. The family dynamics that had seemed so natural before Claire's arrival, the assumption that age meant incompetence, the willingness to make decisions for me rather than with me, had to be completely rebuilt. "I keep thinking about all the times I talked over you," Rachel had confessed during one of our family counseling sessions. "All the times I assumed I knew what was best for you without actually asking what you wanted. Claire didn't create those patterns. She just exploited them." It was a painful but necessary recognition. Claire's manipulation had been so effective, precisely because she'd tapped into existing attitudes about aging and independence that were pervasive in our culture. Even loving families could become unwitting accomplices to elder abuse if they weren't careful about respecting their older members' autonomy and dignity. The counseling had helped us establish new patterns of communication and decision-making. Now, when major decisions needed to be made about the estate or the business, we held family meetings where everyone's opinion was heard and respected. I might be the matriarch, but I wasn't the dictator. We functioned as a team of equals who happened to be related. The foundation work had become my new passion, but it hadn't consumed my life entirely. I'd also discovered interests and abilities I'd never had time to explore when I was younger. The memoir writing had sparked a love of literature, And I joined a book club in town where I was known not as the woman who caught a serial killer, but simply as Eleanor, the member who always had strong opinions about character development. I'd also taken up painting, of all things. What had started as an attempt to capture the estate's gardens in watercolor had evolved into a genuine artistic pursuit. My paintings, mostly landscapes and nature scenes from the mountain region, had been displayed in several local galleries, with proceeds going to support the foundation's work. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been my friendship with Detective Maria Santos of the State Police. Maria had been the lead investigator on Claire's case, and she'd been so impressed with the quality of evidence Margaret and I had gathered that she'd recruited us as civilian consultants on other elder abuse cases. "You two have a gift for this," Maria had told us after we'd helped solve a particularly complex case involving a nursing home administrator who had been systematically stealing from patients' accounts. "You understand the psychology of these crimes in a way that most law enforcement officers don't." The consulting work had taken me to places I'd never imagined visiting: courtrooms where I testified as an expert witness, police stations where I helped interview victims, and conferences where I trained other investigators in recognizing the signs of financial exploitation. At an age when most people were settling into quiet retirement, I was traveling the country and making a difference in ways I'd never dreamed possible. "Grandma, you're not paying attention," Tommy scolded as we searched through the garden shed for supplies. I asked if we should put windows in the caterpillar house. "Sorry, sweetheart," I said, focusing on his serious 4-year-old face. "I was thinking about transformations. Yes, we should definitely put windows in the house so the caterpillar can see out while it's changing." As we worked together to build what was essentially a deluxe terrarium, Tommy kept up a steady stream of questions about butterflies, caterpillars, and the mysterious process of metamorphosis. His curiosity reminded me of Michael at that age, always wanting to understand how things worked, never satisfied with simple answers. The pain of losing Michael would never completely fade, but it had evolved from a sharp, overwhelming grief into something more manageable, a sadness that coexisted with gratitude for the time we'd had together and pride in the man he'd become. The Foundation's work felt like a way of honoring his memory, ensuring that his death hadn't been in vain. "There," I said as we finished constructing the caterpillar's temporary home. "Now we need to find some leaves for it to eat." "What kind of leaves?" Tommy asked. "Well, we need to figure out what kind of caterpillar this is first," I explained. "Different caterpillars eat different plants. We'll have to do some research." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Like detective work?" "Exactly like detective work," I confirmed, thinking about how much my life had become about solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths. We spent the next hour in the garden, examining leaves and consulting the nature guides I kept on the porch. Tommy proved to be an excellent research assistant, carefully comparing the caterpillar's markings to the pictures in the books, until we identified it as a future swallowtail butterfly. "So it really will fly?" he asked, his skepticism finally giving way to wonder. "It really will," I assured him. "But it's going to take time, and it might seem like nothing is happening for a while. The most important changes often happen when we can't see them." As if summoned by our conversation, Margaret's truck turned into the driveway. She'd been spending more time at the estate lately, partly because of our foundation work, but mostly because she'd become part of our extended family. The spare bedroom had officially become Margaret's room, and she used it as a home base between her travels. "Perfect timing," Margaret called as she climbed out of her truck. "I have news about the Henderson case." The Henderson case was our latest consulting project, a situation in Florida where an elderly man's caregiver was suspected of forging his signature on checks and gradually isolating him from his family. Margaret and I had been working with local authorities to build a case against the caregiver, using techniques we'd developed from our experience with Claire. "Good news or bad news?" I asked as Margaret joined us on the porch. "Good news," she replied with satisfaction. "They arrested Jennifer Walsh this morning. The bank records we helped them analyze provided enough evidence for a warrant, and they found forged documents in her apartment." "Jennifer Walsh?" I blinked in confusion. "That's not the same Jennifer Walsh who worked with Harold on our case, is it?" Margaret shook her head. "Different person entirely. Just a coincidence. But the investigative techniques are the same. Follow the money? Document the patterns, build the timeline. The Henderson family is going to get justice because of what we learned from fighting Claire. Tommy had been listening to our conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult discussions they don't quite understand. Are you talking about catching bad guys? He asked. We're talking about helping families stay safe, I explained. Sometimes there are people who try to hurt older folks or take their money, and we help the police catch them. Like superheroes? Tommy's eyes widened with excitement. Margaret laughed. More like super grandmothers, she said. We might not have capes, but we're pretty good at fighting crime. The conversation was interrupted by David calling from the kitchen. Lunch is ready. And Mom, you have a phone call from that producer in New York. The producer was calling about a documentary that was being made about elder abuse and financial crimes. My case with Claire had become something of a landmark, and filmmakers were interested in telling the story to a wider audience. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention, but I recognized that publicity could help the Foundation's mission. Tell him I'll call back after lunch, I said. Family time comes first. As we gathered around the dining room table, the same table where I'd once felt isolated and helpless while my children planned my exile, I marveled at how completely our family dynamics had changed. David and Sarah included me in their parenting decisions about Tommy, asking for my advice rather than assuming I was out of touch with modern child rearing. Rachel regularly sought my input on business strategies for her catering company, valuing my decades of experience in running operations. Most importantly, they listened to me. Really listened, not with the patronizing patience adults show to children or confused elderly relatives, but with the respect due to someone whose opinions mattered. So what's the plan for this afternoon? Sarah asked as we finished Margaret's famous apple pie, a recipe she'd learned from her own grandmother. I promised Tommy we'd monitor the caterpillar's progress, I said, and I need to review the applications for the Foundation's new victim advocacy program. I'll help with the applications, Margaret offered, and I want to show you the preliminary report from the National Institute of Justice about the effectiveness of the Whitmore Protocol. What about tonight? David asked. Are we still planning to have dinner on the terrace? Family dinners on the terrace had become a tradition. Weather permitting, we'd gather as the sun set over the mountains, sharing stories about our days and making plans for the future. It was during these dinners that some of our best ideas for the Foundation had been born, and where Tommy had learned that being part of a family meant everyone's voice mattered. Absolutely, I said. And I want to hear about Tommy's first swimming lesson this morning. I went underwater, Tommy announced proudly, and I didn't even cry. That's very brave, I told him. Learning new things can be scary, but it's also exciting. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself moving between the various activities that now filled my days. Foundation work, family time, creative pursuits, and the simple pleasure of watching a caterpillar begin its transformation into something magnificent. The applications for the Victim Advocacy Program were particularly moving. We'd received requests from all over the country, from people who wanted to be trained to help families facing financial exploitation. Many of the applicants were themselves survivors of elder abuse who wanted to help others avoid their experiences. Look at this one, Margaret said, handing me an application from a woman in Oregon. Her mother was victimized by a romance scammer who convinced her to drain her retirement accounts. The daughter tried to intervene, but couldn't get law enforcement to take it seriously until it was too late. Now she wants to become an advocate to help other families recognize the warning signs. Stories like these reminded me why the Foundation's work was so important. For every Claire Price who was caught and convicted, there were dozens of other predators operating with impunity, targeting vulnerable adults whose families didn't know how to protect them. We're going to need to expand the program, I said, reviewing the stack of applications. The demand is much higher than we anticipated. That's a good problem to have, Margaret replied. It means we're filling a real need. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, I'd been seen as someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. Now I was running an organization dedicated to protecting others from exactly the kind of predator who had targeted my family. As evening approached, we gathered on the terrace for dinner. The view from the estate's elevated position offered a panoramic vista of the mountain valley, with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. It was the same view I'd enjoyed for over 50 years, but it felt different now. Less like a beautiful prison, and more like a hard-won sanctuary. "Grandma Eleanor," Tommy said as we finished our meal, "can we check on the caterpillar before bedtime?" "Of course," I said. "But remember, transformation takes time. It might look like nothing is happening for a while." We trooped over to the garden to examine our temporary resident. The caterpillar had settled onto one of the leaves we'd provided and seemed to be resting comfortably in its new home. "When will it start changing?" Tommy asked. "When it's ready," I told him. Some changes happen quickly, but the most important ones usually take time. As we stood watching the caterpillar in the fading light, I reflected on my own transformation over the past 3 years. Like the caterpillar, I'd had to go through a period of seeming dormancy, the months of investigation and legal proceedings when my life felt suspended between my old identity and whatever came next. But unlike the caterpillar's metamorphosis, my transformation hadn't happened in isolation. I'd been surrounded by people who believed in me, supported me, and helped me discover capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Margaret's friendship, Harold and Jennifer's legal expertise, my children's eventual understanding, and even Tommy's innocent questions about change. All of these relationships had contributed to my evolution from victim to victor. "I think it's bedtime for little boys," Sarah said, scooping Tommy up in her arms, despite his protests that he wasn't tired. "But I want to stay with Grandma Eleanor," he complained. "Grandma Eleanor will be here tomorrow," David assured him. "And the day after that, and the day after that." The promise carried weight that it wouldn't have 3 years ago. Back then, my presence in my family's life had felt temporary, contingent on their patience and tolerance. Now it felt permanent, rooted in genuine love and mutual respect rather than obligation. After Tommy was tucked into bed, the adults settled back onto the terrace with coffee and the comfortable silence that comes from being with people who don't require constant entertainment. Margaret was reviewing files on her laptop, David and Sarah were planning their weekend, and Rachel was sketching ideas for a wedding cake that would feature hand-painted sugar flowers. I found myself thinking about Claire, something I tried not to do too often but couldn't entirely avoid. She was serving her life sentence at a maximum security facility in Colorado, and according to the last update I'd received from the prosecutor's office, she'd been placed in solitary confinement after attempting to manipulate other inmates into helping her file frivolous appeals. Even in prison, Claire couldn't stop trying to control and exploit the people around her. It was a sobering reminder that some people were simply incapable of genuine change, no matter how dramatically their circumstances shifted. But for every Claire Price, there were hundreds of people, like the ones who wrote to me after reading my book, people who found the courage to fight back against exploitation, families who learned to communicate more effectively, and communities that became more vigilant about protecting their vulnerable members. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said, looking up from her laptop. "Just thinking about how much has changed," I replied. 3 years ago, I felt like my life was ending. Now it feels like it's just beginning." "That's because it is," Margaret said with conviction. "Everything before Claire was just preparation for who you were meant to become." It was a generous interpretation, but I thought there might be some truth to it. All the years of managing a household, helping run a business, raising children, and surviving personal losses had given me skills I'd never recognized as valuable. It had taken a crisis to reveal that the supposedly fragile elderly woman was actually a formidable opponent when properly motivated. "I got a call from the Justice Department today," Margaret continued. "They want us to consult on a task force that's being formed to address elder financial abuse on a national level. Apparently, our success rate in identifying and prosecuting these cases has caught their attention." The opportunity was both thrilling and daunting. Working with federal law enforcement would exponentially increase our ability to help families, but it would also mean more travel, more testimony, and more public attention. "What do you think?" Margaret asked. "I think Claire Price made a serious mistake when she decided to target our family," I said with satisfaction. "She thought she was destroying an elderly widow. Instead, she created a crusader." As the evening wound down and our family members began drifting toward their respective homes and bedrooms, I found myself alone on the terrace with the stars emerging overhead. The same stars I'd looked at as a young bride moving into this house, as a new mother worried about my children's futures, as a wife caring for a dying husband, and as a widow facing an uncertain future. But tonight, I wasn't looking at them with fear or uncertainty. I was looking at them with anticipation for whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow might bring. At 76, I discovered that life's most important chapters might not be written until you think the story is nearly over. The woman who had almost been erased by a criminal conspiracy had instead become a voice for justice, a protector of the vulnerable, and proof that age could be a source of power rather than frailty. Tomorrow, I would continue working to build a world where families like mine didn't have to face predators like Claire alone. I would keep writing, speaking, and fighting for the recognition that older adults deserved respect, autonomy, and protection. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Whitmore, sitting on the terrace of the home I'd fought to keep, surrounded by the family I'd worked to heal, and filled with gratitude for the opportunity to transform my greatest crisis into my most meaningful contribution. The caterpillar in the garden would begin its metamorphosis when it was ready. For me, the transformation was complete. I'd emerged from the cocoon of conventional expectations about aging, and discovered that I could fly higher and farther than I'd ever imagined possible. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not as an outsider looking in, but as the heart of a family and a movement that proved every day that some stories get better with age. In the distance, I could hear Tommy's sleepy voice asking Sarah one more question about butterflies. Soon, he would learn that the most beautiful transformations often come from the darkest struggles, and that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the most unexpected places. But for now, he was just a little boy who believed his grandmother could do anything. And you know what? He was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.